The night was brutally cold, the kind of cold that steals breath and numbs skin in seconds. Snow covered the land like a white ocean, endless and silent. But in the middle of that silence, a soft, broken cry pushed through the wind. It came from a little girl, trapped and helpless, buried almost to her neck in the frozen ground. Her small face was the only part still visible, turning pale from the biting air. She couldn't move. She couldn't reach help. The snow held her like a trap, and the darkness around her felt endless. Her breaths grew slower. The cold was not just outside, it was sinking deeper into her body. Every minute that passed pushed her closer to a fate no child should ever face. She looked around, but there was no one. No lights. No footsteps. Only the sound of the wind brushing over the snow. But far away, someone was listening. A Comanche warrior moved through the winter landscape, wrapped in furs, his senses sharp. He knew the land well, every sound, every shadow, every shape in the distance. He had traveled miles that day, guided only by instinct and the rhythm of his own footsteps. He expected the usual noises of a cold night, cracking ice, shifting winds, distant animals. What he heard instead was strange, too soft to be an animal, too weak to be a grown person. It was fragile, almost like a whisper. He stopped, holding his breath to listen again. There it was, a faint cry carried by the wind. He turned toward the sound, narrowing his eyes as he scanned the white landscape. Nothing moved. Nothing broke the surface of the snow. But something inside him, something deeper than instinct, told him to follow the sound. He stepped off his path and moved carefully, listening after every few steps. The cry came again, weaker than before. He walked faster. The wind grew harsher, pushing against him, but he didn't slow. He knew that a voice that weak meant someone was fading fast. And in this cold, fading meant minutes, not hours. He kept moving until he finally saw it. A tiny shape in the snow. A face. A child's face barely above the surface, eyes glassy from the cold. In that moment the warrior understood everything, and he knew he could not turn away. The land around them looked endless, a frozen world where everything moved slowly if it moved at all. Snow covered every hill, every ridge, every fallen tree. It wasn't soft snow, the gentle kind that children play in. This snow was hard, crusted by the wind, sharpened by nights of freezing storms. Each gust lifted tiny crystals from the ground and threw them through the air like needles. The sky hung heavy and gray, with no sign of the sun. It felt as if the day itself had been swallowed by winter. The cold wasn't just cold. It was alive. It pressed against the skin, pushed through clothing, crawled into bones. Anyone caught outside too long had to keep moving or risk becoming part of the land itself, another shape buried beneath the white. Hours before the warrior found the girl, she had wandered through this same landscape, frightened and alone. She had started the day with her family, but the storm had changed everything. The wind came suddenly, blowing so fiercely that she lost sight of the path. Snow swirled around her in thick waves, blinding her eyes and muffling the voices of the people calling her name. She tried following their sound, but the storm twisted every direction. Nothing felt familiar anymore. Step by step, she drifted away from safety without knowing it. At first, she told herself to be brave. She had been taught to stay calm, to think clearly, to keep walking until she saw something she recognized. But the storm didn't let her think. The wind kept pushing her sideways, forcing her to fight for every foot. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in the warmth she still had left. Her feet sank deeper into the snow each time she stepped. Her boots grew heavy. Her breath turned into small clouds that floated for a moment and then vanished into the cold air. She didn't know how long she walked. The world around her kept shifting. Hills looked flat. Trees looked like shadows. Every direction seemed the same. Then the ground beneath her suddenly dropped. A deep drift, hidden under a thin crust of ice, gave way. She fell into a pocket of soft snow, so deep that her legs and most of her body disappeared in seconds. The snow fell back over her, filling the space around her shoulders and chest. She clawed at it desperately, but the more she moved, the more it collapsed around her, trapping her tighter each time. Her heart pounded. She tried to scream for help, but the wind carried her voice away before it reached anyone. She pushed again, but the snow was too heavy. Her hands trembled as she tried to free herself, and soon her fingers grew numb. She couldn't feel them anymore. The cold crawled higher and higher, biting at her neck and cheeks. She took shallow breaths because the snow pressed against her ribs. She wanted to cry, but even her tears felt too cold to fall. The storm quieted after a while, but the silence made everything worse. With no wind, she could hear her own breathing, slow, shaky, fragile. She imagined her family still searching, calling her name, but she didn't know if they were near or far. The land was too wide. The snow was too deep. The silence felt endless. Time stretched in strange ways. Minutes felt like hours. Her thoughts blurred. She tried to wiggle her toes, but she couldn't. She tried to lift her arms, but they were stuck. Her eyelids grew heavy. She tried to keep them open, but they kept falling shut. Part of her wanted to sleep. The cold made everything quiet inside her, almost peaceful. But she remembered something her mother once said: never sleep in the cold. Stay awake. Stay alive. So she forced her eyes open again. She listened to the land. At first she heard nothing. Then she heard something faint. She couldn't tell if it was real or her imagination. It sounded like footsteps, very far away, crunching through the snow. She wanted to call out, but when she opened her mouth, only a weak sound came out. She tried again, pushing with all the strength she had left. The sound was small, but it carried just enough to escape the still air around her. The land itself seemed to absorb the noise, but it didn't swallow everything. The warrior, miles away, heard something, barely a whisper, yet enough to make him stop. The girl didn't know that. All she knew was that she had cried out, and the world felt exactly the same afterward, cold, empty, silent. Her thoughts drifted again. She imagined her mother's warm hands, her father's voice, the way their fire crackled at night. She pictured their home, safe and familiar. She wanted to be there more than anything. She fought the urge to sleep again. Her head leaned to the side. Her breath grew slower. Her vision blurred. The cold wasn't attacking her anymore. It was trying to claim her gently, quietly, without pain. The landscape around her remained still, as if watching, waiting. The girl didn't know that help was moving toward her, step by step, closing the distance. She didn't know that someone strong enough to fight the cold, someone who understood the land better than most, was already following the faint trail of her voice. Right then, all she knew was the snow around her, the numbness in her limbs, and the feeling that she was fading. She tried to speak again, though it felt impossible. Her lips barely moved. But somewhere in the quiet, her voice reached the air one more time, soft and fragile, like a spark in the darkness. And that spark carried farther than she ever could have imagined. The warrior moved toward the sound with calm, steady steps. He didn't rush at first. He listened more than he walked, letting the wind guide him. His senses had been sharpened by years on the land. He could tell the difference between the cry of an animal and the call of a human. What he heard wasn't loud, but it was desperate. That kind of sound doesn't come from a creature of the forest. It comes from someone in trouble, someone fighting to stay alive. He paused again, letting his breath settle. The wind shifted, bringing the faint echo back to him. It was weaker than before. A sinking feeling tightened inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't learned from any teacher. It was something deeper, a pull, a responsibility. He changed direction and began moving faster. Every step broke through the crust of snow. The surface cracked under his weight, sending soft puffs of powder up around his legs. He didn't care how cold the wind was. He didn't care how far he had to go. The cry had come from a child. He could hear it in the tone. And a child buried out here had no time. He pushed forward with more urgency now, scanning the ground for signs. He looked for small tracks, snowdrifts, disturbed patches where something or someone had fallen. The land was stubborn, hiding its secrets beneath layers of white. But the warrior was patient. He knew that even the smallest mark could guide him, and he trusted his eyes to notice what others might miss. Finally, he saw something strange. Not a footprint, not a shadow, just a small shape rising slightly above the smooth surface of the snow. He slowed, careful not to frighten whoever was there. As he stepped closer, the shape became clearer. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a branch. It was too small for either. And it didn't belong to the land. It was a face. A child's face. Pale, still, almost lost beneath the snow. His heart tightened. For a moment he simply stood there, staring at her. She looked fragile, like a single breath could break her. Her eyes were half open but unfocused. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes. Her lips were blue from the cold. Her hair was frozen in thin strands against her skin. He knelt beside her, brushing away the snow with careful hands. He didn't speak right away. He didn't want to startle her. But she blinked, proving she was still alive. Barely. Her gaze shifted upward, following the movement above her. She couldn't move anything else. He felt the temperature of her skin. Even through his gloves, it was frighteningly cold. She had been there too long, much too long. He leaned close and spoke softly, his voice steady and warm. He didn't expect her to understand his words, but tone alone carried meaning. The girl stared at him, confused but relieved. For the first time since the storm, she wasn't alone. He dug into the snow around her with strong, sure hands. The snow was packed tightly, like it had been pressed by the weight of the storm. Every scoop took effort, but he kept working. He moved quickly but gently, afraid that too much force might hurt her. Her shoulders appeared first, then her arms. She gasped as the pressure around her chest eased, though the air was too cold to bring comfort. When her upper body was free, he lifted her with a smooth motion. She was light, far lighter than she should have been. The cold had drained her strength. Her head fell against his chest as if she didn't have the energy to hold it up. He wrapped her in his heavy fur cloak, letting his own warmth surround her. She shivered, but her body was too exhausted to fight the cold on its own. He knew the danger she was in. He had seen people freeze to death before, their skin turning pale and still while their hearts slowed without warning. This girl was close to that point, closer than she probably realized. He stood with her in his arms and looked across the land. The storm had settled, but the cold remained deep and sharp. He needed to move. Staying in one place would drain the little warmth she still had. He shifted his grip, securing her against him, and began walking. The first steps were slow. The snow was deep, higher than his knees in some places, but he had crossed these lands many times. He knew how to move even when the ground fought back. The girl's small hand rested against his chest, barely gripping his cloak. Her fingers were stiff, thin, lifeless. He covered her hand with his own to warm it. As he walked, he listened to her breathing. It was shallow and uneven. Every few minutes she drifted in and out of awareness. Sometimes she tried to speak, but no words came, only tiny sounds. He answered in a calm voice each time, letting her know she wasn't alone. She leaned closer, responding to the warmth of his body like a fading ember trying to catch fire again. The landscape around them stretched endlessly in every direction. No trail was visible beneath the snow. No smoke from distant fires rose into the sky to guide him. But he didn't hesitate. He knew where to go. His people had shelters scattered through these lands, places meant to protect travelers when storms struck. He aimed for the nearest one, though it was still miles away. With each step, he felt the weight of time pressing against him. The storm had already taken much from this child. If he slowed, even for a moment, the cold might take the rest. So he kept moving, pushing through the snow with strong legs and steady breath. His heartbeat stayed firm, a rhythm the girl could hear when her ear rested against his chest. The wind came back in small bursts, brushing against them as if testing their strength. The warrior narrowed his eyes and leaned forward, sheltering the girl with his body. She was silent now, too weak to make another sound. But her heartbeat, faint as it was, still pulsed against his arm. He focused on that tiny rhythm. It was proof that she was still fighting. And he wasn't going to let that fight end out here in the snow. The wind grew sharper as the warrior pushed forward, but he didn't stop. Each breath came out as a white cloud, drifting upward before dissolving into the cold air. The girl lay quietly in his arms, wrapped tightly in his cloak. Her body barely moved. Only the faint rise and fall of her chest showed she was still holding on. He could feel how cold she was, how light she felt, like a small bird weakened by winter. That thought pushed him to move faster. Snow crunched under his footsteps, slow at first, then steady and strong. The land stretched before him like an endless blanket of white. No path, no markers, no breaks in the horizon, just miles of frozen ground. But he knew these lands as if they were the lines of his own palm. He had traveled them since he was young. He had hunted here, slept here, fought storms here. And now he was crossing them again, carrying a life more fragile than anything he had ever held. The girl shivered softly. Her breath was thin, almost like a whisper. He shifted her gently, letting her rest against his chest so she could catch more of his warmth. Her small hands were so cold that he squeezed them inside his cloak, hoping to bring even a little heat back into her fingers. She didn't react, but he didn't expect her to. She was too far gone for that. The ground became uneven as he approached a hill. Snowdrifts piled up along the slope, reaching almost to his waist. He planted his feet firmly, lifting each step with strength and purpose. He didn't want to risk falling. If he did, she could slip from his arms, and her body was too delicate to take another shock. He climbed slowly, leaning forward, shielding her from the wind that swept over the ridge. The cold bit at his face, but he didn't flinch. Pain didn't matter now. She mattered. At the top of the hill, the world opened again. The valley stretched below, wide and silent. The sky darkened as the first hints of night crept in. He couldn't let darkness catch him out in the open. Night cold was different. It was sharper, heavier, unforgiving. He increased his pace, each stride determined and powerful. After a while, the girl stirred slightly. Her head shifted, and her voice came out in a fragile breath, too soft to form a real word. He answered her in a calm voice, speaking gently even though he wasn't sure she could hear him. He told her to stay awake, to stay with him. She blinked slowly, but her eyes didn't fully open. Still, the small movement gave him hope. As he continued walking, a distant sound caught his attention, a long, mournful cry carried by the wind. He paused and listened carefully. The cry came again, this time closer. Wolves. A pack. Their voices echoed through the valley. He looked toward the direction of the howl and saw shadows moving along the ridge. The wolves were far away, but the wind carried the scent of the girl. Wolves were clever. They could sense weakness. They could track it. He tightened his grip on her and turned slightly, adjusting his route. He didn't fear the wolves, but he wouldn't risk bringing danger closer to her. The weight in his arms reminded him of her fragile state. She couldn't survive another threat. Not cold, not predators, not fear. He moved away from the ridge, heading into a cluster of tall pines that offered some shelter from the wind. Snow fell from the branches as he passed beneath them. The forest felt different from the open land, darker, tighter, quieter. The shadows shifted between the trees as the last light faded. He kept walking, every step watched carefully, every sound noted. He wasn't alone out here, but he carried something precious, and he was willing to defend it with everything he had. The girl's breathing became weaker. He felt her tremble once, then fall still. That moment made him tense. He stopped under a thick tree, shielding them from the wind, and checked her face. Her skin looked almost translucent in the fading light. He placed his hand gently on her cheek. It was frighteningly cold. He leaned closer, the warmth of his breath brushing her forehead. "Stay," he whispered, though he knew she didn't understand his language. "Stay with me." She didn't respond. Her eyes fluttered once, barely more than a twitch. He couldn't stop. Not even for a minute. She needed heat, movement, shelter, anything that kept her body from slipping deeper into the cold. He started forward again, pushing harder now. His muscles burned from the weight and the effort, but he didn't slow. The snow thickened as he moved deeper into the forest, rising almost to his thighs in some places. Every step demanded strength. Still, he kept the same rhythm, left, right, left, like a heartbeat he refused to let fade. The shelter wasn't far now. He knew it by instinct, by memory, by the shape of the land beneath his feet. The trees thinned as he approached a clearing. Through the branches ahead, he saw what he was looking for, a low structure built from logs and covered with animal hides. A winter shelter built by his people, used during hunts and storms. He felt a surge of relief, but he didn't let it slow him. He pushed through the last stretch of snow, breath heavy but steady. The girl's head rested limply against him, her body almost weightless now. He reached the shelter door, lifted the hide flap with one hand and stepped inside. The warmth was faint, just the leftover heat from the last fire, but it was still warmer than the outside. He lowered to one knee, keeping the girl wrapped tightly in his cloak. For the first time since he heard her cry, he allowed himself one deep breath. He had made it this far. Now he just had to keep her alive long enough for help to reach them. The warrior closed the hide flap behind him, and the world outside disappeared in an instant. The wind, the wolves, the empty snowfields, all of it fell silent. The shelter wasn't warm, but compared to the biting air outside, it felt like stepping into another world. The space was small, barely big enough for a few people, built only for emergencies like this. Animal skins hung along the walls to keep out drafts. A few logs lay in a corner, left for anyone who might stumble in during a storm. He lowered the girl carefully onto a pile of furs. Her body barely sank into them. She was so stiff, so cold, so light. Her eyes stayed half-closed and her breathing was shallow, thin, almost fragile enough to break. He put his hand on her cheek again. No warmth. Not even a spark. He moved quickly, knowing time was slipping away like snow falling from a branch. He built a small fire using the logs, dried grass, and flint that the shelter always kept. Sparks jumped. Smoke curled upward. Then flames caught, spreading slowly, softly, warming the air around them. The fire cracked as if waking from a long sleep. Its glow painted the girl's skin in shades of orange, bringing a little color back to her face. He brought her closer to the heat, but not too close. When someone is frozen, too much warmth too fast can hurt them even more. So he warmed her gradually. First her hands, then her feet, then her face. He rubbed her arms gently through the thick cloak, pushing warmth into her skin. Her frozen fingers didn't move. Her eyelids fluttered like she was drifting away again. He leaned in and whispered to her softly, letting his voice be the anchor she needed. He didn't know her name and she didn't know his, but he spoke anyway. Words didn't matter, tone did. Calm, strong, comforting. The sound alone told her not to let go. The fire grew brighter. The heat grew stronger. He watched her closely, waiting for any sign that the warmth was reaching her. For a long time, nothing changed. Then her fingers twitched slightly inside the cloak. It was small, a movement so tiny it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But he saw it. Relief washed over him. He dipped a piece of cloth in warm water from a leather pouch he carried, then pressed it gently to her forehead. The girl's lips parted slightly as she pulled in a deeper breath. Her chest rose, slowly but with more strength than before. Her skin, once pale as snow, began to take on the faintest shade of life again. He fed the fire another log. Sparks leapt up as the flames spread. The warmth wrapped around them like a blanket, pushing back the cold that had clung to her body. Outside, the wind howled again, but the shelter held firm. The storm could rage all it wanted. Inside, he had created a small island of safety. The girl's eyes opened a little more now. They were unfocused, wandering weakly, trying to understand where she was. He leaned closer so she could see him clearly. Her gaze landed on him, confusion mixing with trust. She didn't know him, but she could feel he meant no harm. Even in her weakened state, she understood one thing: she was alive because of him. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a faint tremble of air. He shook his head gently, letting her know she didn't need to say anything. She had to save her strength. Her eyelids lowered, then lifted again, fighting the heavy pull of sleep. He encouraged her with soft words, keeping her awake just enough so she wouldn't slip too far into the cold's grip. The fire warmed the shelter more and more, filling it with a comforting glow. The girl's breathing settled into a steadier rhythm. The warrior adjusted her cloak and pulled extra furs around her legs. He made sure no part of her body was exposed to the lingering cold. After a while, he stepped outside to gather more wood from the pile stored near the shelter. The cold struck him immediately, sharp and furious, as if the storm was angry he had stolen a life from its freezing grasp. He ignored it. He grabbed enough wood to last through the night, then returned inside quickly. The girl hadn't moved from where he left her, but her skin had gained a bit more color. The firelight danced on her cheeks. When he knelt beside her again, she looked at him with clearer eyes. She studied his face, the patterns painted on his skin, the braids in his hair, the fur cloak still dusted with snow. There was fear in her at first, fear of the unknown, but it faded when she saw the gentleness in his eyes. She attempted to speak again, and this time a small, broken sound came out. Not a word, just a tiny piece of her voice. He placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, telling her through his calm expression that she was safe. Minutes passed, then hours. The fire crackled. The storm outside roared and softened and roared again. The warrior stayed awake the whole time, feeding the flames, checking her breathing, keeping watch. He was tired. He had walked miles through brutal winds carrying her weight, but he didn't let himself rest. Not yet. He sat beside her, alert and steady, ready for anything. Every time her breath wavered, he moved closer. Every time she shivered, he pressed more warmth toward her. Slowly, piece by piece, life returned to her body. The firelight glowed across her face, revealing the beginnings of strength that had been nearly frozen away. She wasn't out of danger yet, but she was no longer slipping toward the quiet, final stillness that had almost claimed her. Because someone had lifted her from the snow, carried her for miles, and refused to let the cold win. The fire burned steadily through the night, its soft crackling filling the small shelter with life. The girl slept lightly, drifting between warmth and exhaustion, her breaths no longer shallow whispers but something steadier, something that hinted she was fighting her way back. The warrior sat beside her, his back straight, his eyes never fully closing. He listened to every shift in the flames, every gust of wind outside, every small movement she made under the furs. He wasn't guarding the shelter. He was guarding her, this fragile child who had no reason to trust him, yet whose life now rested entirely in his hands. When morning light finally touched the world, it came faintly through the cracks near the roof. Pale and thin, like winter itself wasn't ready to give up the night. The girl stirred, blinking slowly. She looked stronger than before, though still weak. Her fingers flexed inside the cloak, moving with effort. The warrior noticed immediately, and leaned toward her to check her face. Her eyes drifted up to meet his, clearer now, less clouded by cold and fear. For a moment she simply watched him. She looked at the fire, then at the heavy furs wrapped around her, then back at his face. Her brow tightened slightly, as if trying to gather memories that were scattered like snowflakes in the wind. It all came back to her slowly. The storm, the fall, the suffocating cold, the voice she heard through the blur, the arms that lifted her from the snow, the steady heartbeat she had felt against her cheek as he carried her through the storm. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled. The warrior gently pressed a hand to her shoulder, telling her through gesture alone to rest. She sank back down, her breath quickening for a moment, but she knew he was right. Her strength was returning, but not enough to rise. He poured warm water from a small pouch and let her sip it through her trembling lips. It was the first thing she had tasted since the storm. The heat spread through her chest, waking parts of her body that still felt half asleep. After a few sips, her breathing eased. The shelter felt warmer now. The fire had eaten through most of the wood but still burned clean and bright. Outside, the storm had settled into a quiet hush, a silence that followed heavy snowfall. The world beyond the hide door was different now, calmer and softer, like the land itself had paused to breathe. The warrior knew what needed to happen next. The girl needed real help, a safe place, food, people who understood her language and could comfort her. He could warm her, defend her, carry her, but he could not give her everything she needed. He had done his part, but the journey wasn't finished. He looked at her again. She watched him with growing awareness, her eyes following every motion. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else, trust. Not full trust, but enough. She understood that he had saved her life. A child doesn't need many words to feel safety. When he stood and stepped outside to check the sky, the cold hit him sharply. The storm clouds had broken apart. The valley lay quiet, covered in untouched blankets of white. The trees held layers of snow that sparkled faintly in the pale sun. It was a dangerous beauty, but it also meant travel was possible again. He returned to the girl and began preparing for the journey. He tightened the straps on his pack, checked the flint and tools he carried, and rearranged the furs so she would stay warm when he lifted her again. She watched him with wide, curious eyes. When he knelt in front of her, she reached out a hand, slow, hesitant, and touched his arm. It was a small gesture, weak and trembling, but it held meaning. She didn't want to be left alone. She didn't want the warmth to disappear. She didn't have the strength to speak it, but she didn't need to. The warrior understood. He gave a small nod, reassuring her without words. He lifted her again, wrapping the thick cloak around her until only her eyes peeked out. She fit against him easily, her weight barely noticeable to someone who had carried her through miles of storm the night before. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, a sound that had guided her through the darkness and still made her feel safe. He stepped outside with her in his arms. The cold brushed against them, but this time it felt different. The girl was insulated by layers of warmth. The warrior's footsteps were confident. The land felt open, the sky brighter. He began walking toward the distant settlements, knowing that by nightfall she would be surrounded by people who would shelter her and thank him for his bravery. The journey down the valley was silent except for the gentle rhythm of his steps. The girl watched the trees pass by, the white hills rolling calmly, no longer as frightening as they had been just hours before. The world felt safer from the warmth of his arms. Halfway across the valley, she shifted slightly. Her small voice, barely more than a breath, escaped her lips. It wasn't clear. It wasn't strong, but it was meaningful. She was trying to speak, trying to thank him, trying to show she understood what he had done. He didn't answer with words. He simply adjusted his grip so she rested more comfortably and continued forward. Sometimes the greatest kindness doesn't need language. Sometimes it is carried in actions alone. As they crossed the last rise before the settlement, the sun climbed a little higher. The snow glowed softly. Smoke from distant fires curled upward into the sky. Life waited ahead. Warmth, safety, voices she knew. The warrior kept walking, steady and calm, carrying the little girl who had been buried to her neck in the snow just one night before. She was alive now, alive because a stranger heard a faint cry in the cold and chose to follow it. Alive because someone saw not an enemy, nor a burden, but a child whose life still deserved to be protected. And as the settlement grew closer, the girl held on to him with the last of her strength, trusting that every step he took would bring her closer to home.